the link, because I think the one I posted earlier wasn't working. Okay, I think we can start and people will join in. We can make at least acquaintance with the people already in the room. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Arnold Kwesiga, and I work with the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, the Business and Human Rights Unit, and the organizers of this webinar, but also looking at sharing findings from a research study that we conducted on monitoring the African Development Bank's response measures to the COVID-19 pandemic, what the money was used for and how, and the different accountability and transparency mechanisms that civil society could engage with to ensure effective implementation of projects, but also advanced socio-economic transformation. This all flowing from the African Development Bank's theme of 2021, building resilient economies in post-COVID-19 Africa. So there's a lot of conversation that has been had with different partners. Some of them will be part of this conversation as key partners that have worked on monitoring international financial institutions on the grants and loans they extend to member states, but also private sector around strengthening socio-economic measures and mechanisms towards recovery processes post-COVID-19. So on this webinar, we have the International Accountability Project. John Mwebe representing them. They have worked around the topic of conversation. We have Bank Information Center, and we have also the Coalition on Human Rights in Development, Titi, who will be joining us later on, that also really focus on the work of international financial institutions, but also the African Development Bank. I'll give more background to the study later on, but at this point, I want to welcome Professor Franz, the Director of the Center for Human Rights, to give us welcome remarks as we start our conversation on this webinar around monitoring the AfDB response mechanisms or measures towards the COVID-19. Prof. Franz.
Thank you very much, Arnold, and good day, everyone, wherever you may find yourself. Most welcome to our panelists, everyone involving themselves in the project and those attending this. I think the background, Arnold started to elaborate upon that. I could just say that, as we all know, COVID-19 was a crisis and a threat and a pandemic of many dimensions. Clearly, it was a health pandemic, and it had implications for people's health, and the consequent measures taken had many social ramifications, sometimes political ramifications. But clearly, it also was a crisis that emanated into and evolved into issues of grave economic concern. So it ultimately was also a crisis of an economic nature. So as much as perhaps a center like ours usually would be focusing on human rights related or governance related aspects of an issue such as COVID-19, in this respect, we also wanted to draw the link to resources and to the economic aspect. That has been done by others to look at how international financial institutions actually have responded to, have given loans, have been responsive to the needs of people on the ground. Other IFIs such as the World Bank and the IMF have been scrutinized, but I think it's less true of the African Development Bank. So the center commissioned a study to look at exactly that question. To what extent had the African Development Bank responded to the issues that really are on the ground in terms of its competences and abilities in the context of that crisis. So initially a full paper was evolved and developed, as this has been supported by the German Development Agency, GIZ, And then subsequently, we had Joseph, who's one of the panelists, also involved into contracting it, making it slightly more streamlined, bringing out a kind of more accessible version in terms of the findings and the language used. So thank you very much also to the initial author and to Joseph. So today, we just wanted to give some kind of overview of that summarized version of the study and give inputs and further disseminate the findings. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to the panelists for also contributing with your perspectives on this issue and on this report. We really look forward to a productive discussion and taking the issues forward subsequently. Once again, welcome and thank you for joining.
Thank you very much, Prof. Franz, for those welcome remarks. And I'll, because we've also eaten a bit into our time, so I'll just try to add on the things that Prof has mentioned, but also what I opened with. One of the things, or one of the reasons that we thought really this is important post-COVID, but also during COVID, because the study was conducted at the time when, yes, we are recovering from the pandemic, but also we had a lot of conversations with partners that noted there is a huge focus or the already existing efforts that are being done by civil society actors globally to track and monitor the activity of IFIs, international financial institutions, to support countries in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But a lot of emphasis was really put on the World Bank and IMF, and many civil society actors had really, even prior to the crisis, IFI advocacy had mostly targeted the World Bank Group and the IMF. So we conducted a bit of research study, desktop largely, and so, research done around the influence on social service delivery through their technical advice, through their loans and projects. The IFC specifically has been on the hook for its investments in private sector delivery of basic social services such as health and education. Many partners and countries had really worked on the impact the bridge international schools that were partly funded by the World Bank and IFC had on the right to education on the continent, but also the important fact that whereas there is a lot of monitoring of these international IFIs, as I noted, the World Bank and the International Financial Corporation, not much was being done when it comes to the African Development Bank. Yet over the years, we saw its capital increasing to 208 billion from 93 billion, which largely was the largest ever capital increase in its history. So it was important that we looked at what has the African Development Bank done over the years, but also how does civil society and other stakeholders come into play? The role of the civil society actors in monitoring, but also in ensuring accountability for the funds that are extended to different countries. And so this study really focused on that, and it was largely desktop, but also we had many conversations at the first discussion with partners as the IAP, International Accountability Project, and the Coalition for Human Rights in Development. And also during the roundtable on the right to development, we had brief conversations on what this meant and how better we can develop strategies around strengthening transparency and accountability mechanisms when it comes to the work or the measures and mechanisms undertaken by the African Development Bank in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic specifically, but also other mechanisms that they may apply or employ going forward. So at this point, we will have, I will invite Mr. Joseph Byomhangi, who is the coordinator for the Uganda Consortium for Corporate Accountability, who helped us work on the initial report that we had, but also try to identify different areas and recommendations that we could undertake going forward. So Joseph will give a presentation on the findings of the research study, but also the recommendations that were made that will guide the Center for Human Rights and partners going forward on how to strengthen our strategies and initiatives around monitoring the African Development Bank and strengthening accountability mechanisms. So Joseph, you have 20 minutes to present to us the key findings from the research, but also the key recommendations that will inform our discussion with partners that have worked around transparency and accountability when it comes to IFIs. Joseph, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arnold. Good day to the participants on the call. I request please to share the point that summarizes my discussion. All right, picking it up from where Arnold has stopped, I hope I can audibly be heard by all participants. I'll speak to the research that the Center for Human Rights conducted on monitoring the African Development Bank's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. At the height of the pandemic, those are the 18 months through which the world was dealing with a crisis. So the main purpose of the study was to review activities of the African Development Bank for about 18 months, largely from February 2020 till September 2021, looking at what the African Development Bank was able to do in responding to the pandemic. This study particularly focused on assessing the loans, the grants that the African Development Bank extended to African countries and also the private sector during the pandemic, what exactly they were spent on, the aspects of transparency and accountability mechanisms that were established during the recovery period as these monies were being extended. The study also analyzed the measures recipient countries, those are the African countries, put in place to address the socio-economic impact of the pandemic. So having discussed the aim of the study, we can go to the key findings. That's with slide 4. Please, let's start with slide 4. Yeah, so summarily, the key findings speak to what we discovered from the study. And the main platform through which the African Development Bank responded to the COVID-19 pandemic was what they called the COVID-19 Response Facility, abbreviated as the CRF. So if you subsequently keep hearing the CRF, you should have it at the back of your mind that it's the COVID-19 Response Facility, to which about $10 billion was allocated. And in addition to the CRF was the platform for the bank to support countries in improving COVID-19 testing. Those of us who happened to travel in that time remember how it was very important that you had to have a COVID-19 test at whichever destination that was valid for 24 hours. So the African Development Bank implemented many of its programs through some of its arms, including the African Development Fund, the Transition Support Facility, and the African Development Institute. Most of the grants and concessional loans dispensed by the African Development Bank were earmarked for specific purposes. This is really important when it comes to the discussion we'll be having around transparency and accountability. So the loans and grants were earmarked for specific purposes in conjunction with what the national governments had mapped out as priorities. And such purposes included enhancing the healthcare sectors of African nations, increasing COVID-19 testing and surveillance, fostering community engagement and risk communication. You remember that there was a lot of communication going about how to prevent the pandemic, how to prevent the spread of COVID, and what needed to be done in case a loved one had contracted COVID. Then expanding social welfare and also supporting the private sector. With regards to the private sector, there were a handful of projects that the African Development Bank took on to bolster private sector resilience during the pandemic. Aside from the Moroccan support, we'll discuss the support that was extended to the Equity Group Holdings. The support was to a tune of $100 million. And Equity Group Holdings is a financial institution, a bank that is headquartered in Kenya. And the purpose of this grant was to facilitate its expansion across Central and Eastern Africa so as to best serve the small, medium enterprises, because we believe they are at the heart of the economy, and therefore that was one of the justifications they had to extend this facility. In other ways in which the African Development Bank supported the private sector was indirectly through country aid grants, and such grants went towards aspects of tax relief, assisting small business owners, including female and young entrepreneurs, awarding grants to cover basic business costs, providing incentives to foster the local production of COVID-19 necessities, such as masks. Then it was mandatory to wear masks for each individual that was moving in public. Then the sanitizers, because it was very important that everyone was sanitizing at every point to reduce the transmission, among other measures. With regards to the civil society, at the time this report was compiled, there was not much evidence that the bank had made sufficient efforts to engage society in organizing its aid responses in various countries. But just to let you know that the report discovered that the African Development Bank had intended to engage civil society through the Civil Society and Community Engagement Division program. However, the findings were that this program was not effectively utilized. So when we go to the issues of implementation and transparency, at the time the report was compiled, there was little or reliable information regarding implementation and accountability relating to the African Development Bank aid packages that were dispensed to the African nations. This is clearly a problem, and as rightly discovered by the report, it's extremely important that the implementation of the aid programs be tracked and that transparency and accountability mechanisms be established and also enforced, not merely establishing them like that program to engage with civil society. So it's extremely important that the aid money is not just discarded while the objectives are not achieved. So still speaking to issues of implementation and transparency, it's where the civil societies may be able to help. Most often, civil society comes on board to track the implementation in their jurisdictions across the member countries in Africa. We have civil society, and as such, they would be coming on board to track the implementation in their jurisdiction and hold governments accountable, as well as the African Development Bank accountable, if this mechanism they had envisioned of the Civil Society and Community Engagement Division program had been functional. And in the discussion, we'll be able to hear from the colleague of Bank Information Center speaking to us how they're able to track the funds dispersed by the World Bank across the different states, and to see to it that the objective of the grants or loans is achieved. She'll be sharing with us the experience they have in tracking those. And in speaking to the conclusion, this is really a summary of the abridged version, but key of the things the report recommends is a strengthened monitoring of the African Development Bank activities so as to ensure transparency and accountability by the civil society organizations. This is one of the major gaps that was identified during the COVID pandemic, particularly the 18 months that the research was looking at the functions of the African Development Bank. We noticed that there was a need to strengthen the monitoring of the activities of the African Development Bank and ensure that there is transparency and accountability. Secondly, the report also calls for an analysis of the accountability and transparency mechanisms for loans advanced to African nations, but also those that are advanced to the private sector. As we have discussed, Equity Group Holdings is one of the beneficiaries of the loans. It would be very important to know if exactly the objective of the loan was achieved, and if so, what mechanisms are there for members of civil society and other stakeholders to monitor the usage of these funds to see to it that they are used as per the objective. And lastly, summarily, the recommendations speak to African nations and also regional economic commissions to upgrade the public sector. Since the focus was on COVID-19 and how the African continent was dealing with COVID-19, the recommendation is that there is need to upgrade the public sector because the resilience of any African nation state to deal with the pandemic largely rested on how functional their public sector was when it came to providing healthcare. Then it also recommends the need to diversify economies, economies that largely relied on tourism, for example, and during the height of the pandemic, it was not possible for that sector of the economy to blossom, were greatly affected as revenues were really cut short. So the need to diversify economies for the African nation states is one of the key recommendations that this report makes. Then the need to engage the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement to increase the volume of trade between African nation states is another recommendation that the report makes. And lastly, it emphasizes the need to implement responsible debt management such that a lot of public resources for the African nation states are not instead going into paying interests and debt servicing, but are going in providing public services to the citizens. So summarily, that's what the report looks like. In case we have more questions and concerns, I'm available to speak to detail to how much resources and for which projects resources African Development Bank sent to West Africa. We have an aggregate of the countries that received that. We have an aggregate of what came to East Africa, Southern Africa. All that is something that we can share in case need arises. Thank you so much, Arnold. I hope I have kept time.
No, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Joseph. And I think as comments come in, I will be able to turn back to you for some of those aggregates on exactly what went where and for what purpose. Yeah, we still have time. I think you used like half the time that was allocated, but I think it gives us a lot of time to have commentary on the report that people from the team and partners that have been able to review the report, but also having a broader conversation, because as the center and partners, a lot of interest was on the private sector involvement in these processes, but also the transparency and accountability mechanisms at national level to track if this support or the finances that were extended to countries were used for that purpose, but also how they then helped in advancing socio-economic transformation of the most vulnerable people that were affected by the pandemic, but also the different sectors that were earmarked for that support. Largely because during the study and for conversations that were had with key persons and partners, it was extremely hard for civil society actors to track, where even where the AfDB had a program that was looking at civil society engagement, it was not utilized to its fruitfulness, because not single civil society talked about engagement with the African Development Bank when it came to response mechanisms to COVID-19. So at this point, and like I said, we'll be able to come back to you, Joseph, as questions come in. But at this point, I will turn to Titi and John, who will give us, a broader commentary or even discussion around the effectiveness, which was a key point, the effectiveness of the response measures towards the public health issue, but also socioeconomic effects of the pandemic. And largely because the Coalition for Human Rights and Development is really now leading a platform that is strengthening monitoring the AfDB, but also accountability, looking at tracking accountability for their activities. And the International Accountability Project, where John Mwebe works, has also been involved in broader engagements around transparency and accountability when it comes to IFIs, international finance institutions. And so I will first turn to Titi to give her remarks around the report, but also broader conversation on how then do we strengthen civil society engagement or even involvement in the platform that is already present, and strengthening activities and initiatives around monitoring the activities of the African Development Bank at the national level, but also broadly at regional block levels, because there's a lot of activities that are supported at that level. So Titi, you're welcome, and you can make your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnold. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me fine. My name is Titi. I'm the Africa Regional Coordinator at the Coalition for Human Rights in Development. The coalition is composed of 100+ organization members. A member organization, sorry, I'm coming from a Francophone background. Member organization, and we, all of our members look at accountability of all the institutions, international finance institution with a specific focus on the African Development Bank for those in Africa. I remember when this conversation started, I think it was last year, when it started around that issue of basically where did our money go during COVID, right? Because the reason why it might sound obvious that I say that, but still we do have that question of why don't you just leave international finance institutions? Please allow me to say IFI. Why don't you just leave IFI alone, right? Why don't you just leave them alone? Why don't you just kind of give them the trust that they need? One of the reasons for that is because it's our money, is public money for most of them, and our governments are shareholders in those institutions. And the African Development Bank specifically has a mandate of reducing poverty on the African continent. It's the only one institution that has a specific mandate on Africa. And so while they're using our money, because it's tax money, it makes sense for us to also look into what they're doing and to hold them accountable to whatever they might be doing and how that money is being spent. And so when that conversation started last year, the question was that, okay, you know, now COVID was not completely over yet, but still, there was still 2020. We went through the whole crisis of 2020, and now we had reached the point where we could sit down and say, okay, what happened here? What did we do? And did it even work? Was this even efficient? And did we reach the purpose that all these actions and projects had? I'd just like to zoom out a little bit from the great findings that this report has. And I love the fact that it's actually, well, I shouldn't say I love, it's just that it goes exactly into a global trend. Right? It's not just the African Development Bank. It really aligns with the work that the coalition does, and also the finding that other organizations and other reports have had, mainly that if you look at the global picture, if you look at the broad picture of all of the IFIs, so the main ones, the AfDB, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank, if you look at the big picture and to have a short answer to where did our money go, the short answer would be, we don't know where that money went, which is concerning, right? For money that's supposed to be tax money and public money. And coming from institutions that hold a public interest mandate, all of them are supposed to primarily serve public interests. Now, how do you hold the African Development Bank accountable? Is one of the less open institutions. IFIs is one of the less open one, also one of the most difficult to engage with, which is the reason why, I think it was in 2021, a group of organizations, a group of CSOs came together around the review of the ISS. So the ISS, the Integrated Safeguard System of the bank, the names are different, but basically all of them have some kind of framework which is supposed to look into the potential risk that could come from the project that they founded, and how to meet, and the mitigation measures that go with those identified risks. And so the review of that framework is usually supposed to be a moment where you talk to CSOs, right? We'll talk to CSOs, you talk to stakeholders. And for some banks like the Asian Development Bank, that process can take years, depending on how open and how transparent the bank wants it to be. It can take years. back and forth between the bank and CSOs until we reach a final version of the text. For the African Development Bank, if I remember correctly, I think the whole process for a continent that have 54 countries, the whole process was for 54 countries and how many languages, the whole process was supposed to last just 45 days and only one session where all CSOs in all countries will send comments and recommendations, and that will be all. No coming back to CSOs before the final version of the text would be adopted. So that's around the review of that framework that CSOs came together and formed an informal platform. That's the AfDB working group, the African Development Bank working group, which looks into accountability issues, transparency issues, engagement issues within the bank. The platform is open to everybody, to all the CSOs working on the AfDB or just want to keep an eye on what the AfDB is doing. And please reach out to me. I'll leave my email in the chat box. Please reach out to me if you'd like to join that group. But basically, there are ways to hold this institution accountable. On the national level, the bank does have national offices. Some of those national offices also are regional offices. So you can hold them accountable on a national level or on a regional level, or go directly to the headquarters in Abidjan. As citizens of this continent, as taxpayers, as stakeholders, is not a favor that the institution is doing to us by giving us information or just responding to the question of where the money went. It's really our right to be asking for those information and their duty to give us that information. I don't know how much time I have, and I also see some great colleagues here, John and Fiona. And since we all work together and we're all part of that platform, I really don't want to be saying things that they will want to elaborate on later. So maybe I'll just stop here. And if there are questions, comments, or questions directly directed to what the coalition does, I'd be happy to answer. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Titi. And yeah, you're right. I think a lot of conversations from other partners will make, but also for me, what's really important, and we'll be able to track back to you, because you have had the opportunity to actually track what other partners have written around this, and you spoke very well directly to the global trend on exactly what's going on. What is very troubling is that when you say nobody knows where the money went to, but it's a lot of money, because a lot of money was, especially for the African Development Bank, so much was extended to governments, to regional blocks, but also to the private actor like Joseph noted, especially equity holding, for the purpose of actually supporting small and medium enterprises and different groups. But the challenge has always been on how do we track, how do we even, because we're struggling to find report or even national actors that can say, oh, no, we benefited from this, we know. And maybe also the other challenge that happened with these response measures during COVID or post-COVID was that it was part of so many other financial support or grants that came in from either the World Bank or IMF or even European Union and other states to do the same thing. So sometimes became difficult to track. Did the money that supported testing come from the African Development Bank, or was it the same money that came from the World Bank or others? So there's a lot of challenges on that, and I think it's understandable when different reports say nobody can actually say where the money went to. But maybe at that point, I would just turn to John. John may be having the answer. He might know where the money went to. So John, I will turn to you to help us answer that big question, but also share your perspective and activity and work that you've done around this transparency and accountability, but also monitoring is part of the IFI's activities, but more specifically as with this conversation, the African Development Bank. So John, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnold, and good day, everyone. Interesting. If there's anything happening in my background, I take a disclaimer because I'm seated at a public facility. So please, you bear with me. So thank you. I work for the International Accountability Project. Our work is basically, I'm the programs coordinator for the Africa region. And our work is basically to look at financing for development, but also financing for corporations by the international finance institutions, the World Bank, African Development Bank, IFC. So we track 14 of the banks that are doing this work. Let me go straight to financing for COVID. Arnold, I'll ask that you put your video on because I'm using a public. So if people can't hear me, then I'll see you and I'll know that you can communicate or something. Okay, excellent. So let me run, in a minute, let me run some statistics. Out of the 14 finance institutions that we track, we registered 184 projects dealing with COVID in Africa region, out of the 14 banks that we track. But 44 of those projects were financed by the Africa Development Bank across the Africa region. We also, if you look at the 44, 33 of those projects were country specific: Mali, Cameroon, Gambia, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania. They were country specific. And 11 of those were either for blocks, regional blocks like ECOWAS, East African Community, but also there were from multi-country loans, like you could say Ghana, Cameroon, Nigeria, they come together and they get a loan. So those were 11 of those. So those were classified as Africa projects. Interestingly, when we talk about COVID, many people think that we're only talking about health, but we also had projects financed as COVID projects, but in the areas of water and sanitation, in the areas of agriculture, forestry, in the areas of climate change, in the areas of the environment. So when someone thinks about financing for COVID and they think about us seeking accountability from health institutions, you should also know that there were very many other projects that were financed with regard to climate change, environment, and those also could be tracked and accounted for specifically, especially with regard to even the project categories, category A, category B, and all that. So it's not only that. And I want to end with this at that particular thing. When we talk about transparency and we talk about accountability with these projects, we realize that areas or spaces of accountability were really diverse with the COVID project. Now, I want to get to the country systems like Arnold put before us, where we talk about transparency and accountability mechanisms to track how the government used this money, but also how the people benefited, involvement of civil society. World over, COVID brought a freeze. So the movements were freezed, yeah. Interactions in communities were freezed. But the one interesting thing is that projects never stopped. All the COVID projects, none of them never stopped. So the physical accountability, the physical questions of moving here, there, asking about this, support to this medicine, support to this vaccination. A report just got out yesterday that the vaccination that was done in Uganda was water, like people vaccinated with water. We still want to deal with the authenticity of that, but all those were because of the rush. And indeed, the claim of water just did start yesterday. The claim of some people being vaccinated with water came through, but all these are areas of accountability because this was all money that came through. And these are not only Uganda specific issues, they are cutting across the region. So that is one thing. The other thing with the movement itself, for instance, in Uganda, we had an issue. It wasn't a COVID related issue, but I can use it here. We had a project called Wadelai that we were following through. But one, the project was going on during COVID. We were not allowed to move to that area. But even when COVID subsided and we asked the country team from the Africa Development Bank told us that regarding their movement protocols and regarding the pandemic, they will not move. And so they made an assessment of a complaint that was placed before them using the same people that were known as the perpetrators. So you get what I'm saying. As we seek accountability, even in country, in the COVID period, we had issues as that. So we had issues of movement, we had issues of even the bank itself not doing the due diligence and they could justify why they were not doing the due diligence. We are now, but also we are talking about crisis, accountability in a crisis. Yeah, because then everyone was saying, people are dying, let's go, let's get for health, let's get for climate, let's get for this. And accountability in a crisis, not accountability in a normal setting. Yeah, this was a pandemic, and so they got a lot of money and they used it in anywhere, but they would justify it as a crisis. Yeah, so that was also an issue with accountability. Now, I want us to relate it to where we are now. If we are to move backwards and maybe choose to seek accountability for the monies that they were spent, we definitely will get to the institutions, but we'll also have to call in the Africa Development Bank. I should tell you, and this is an experience that TT, Fiona, and I possess doing advocacy at the Africa Development Bank. They're not that responsive. They're not that responsive to sharing information. They're not that responsive. We are having inroads into inroads into those interactions, but yeah, they're just still inroads. So even as we talk about going now to ask for accountability from our countries that receive this money, we still have to speak to the fact that our greatest backbone, that is the management of the Africa Development Bank, through the country offices, are not that very open to a discussion on accountability, because one, they defer it to the country systems. They say, well, first deal with your country system. But also, they tend to say, wait, we also are having our hands tied because of what the crisis was. So where we stand now, how much can we do with regard to seeking accountability? How much can the independent recourse mechanism, which has proved very, very efficient in handling, because at one point we may have to deal with complaints of the misuse of the zero accountability, how suited is the IRM, the independent recourse mechanism, able to handle conflicts, able to handle complaints arising out of failure to account for the COVID funds that came through? That's one. But also two, away from just talking about holding them to account in a phase of the complaint, how then do we say, we are here, this money is still something that we must pay back? How do we look at where we are going forward? The accountability of where we are. Because these projects were not a one-year project. Some of them were 5-year projects, some of them were multi-year projects. How do we talk about where we are? How do we assess them moving forward? So these are all the questions that we are having. I would want to leave it at the questions, though we can always discuss the responses to that and alternatives to that. But for the sake of also my other discussants, let me leave it at that for now. And I'm open to any questions and further discussion.
Okay, no, thank you very much, John. Yeah, you shed more light on some of the things at country level, but also some of the challenges which especially civil society actors faced. Because when you talk about that freedom of movement or physical accountability, how do you ensure physical accountability during a crisis, a pandemic, where freedom of movement was curtailed, but also the challenges of and I know so many times it came through the misinformation or the challenges around understanding the trends within activities that were going on, because they were largely held and controlled by an entity. So there's a lot of conversation. It would be really be good to look at that report you talked about, especially as it affects Uganda around vaccination, because the reality is that so much money was put towards ensuring a vaccination, or ensuring everybody received vaccination to a point where, at a certain point where people gave up on it for various reasons, but also as the pandemic subsided to a point where it was no longer perceived as a threat, the push for vaccination also stopped. But I think we'll also open up these conversations and different people will share their experience and perspective towards that. But also one key point that you've mentioned that I think affected a lot, that also will be a guide on going forward, is really how do you ensure physical accountability during a crisis? or during lockdown or during a time where there's a lot of freeze on what is happening. At this point, I want to turn to Fiona. I know Fiona has worked a long time around transparency and accountability for international financial institutions, especially around, especially the World Bank and IFC, and so shares more insights and expertise or experience on how it's done from that angle, but also what lessons and opportunities can we learn from. I know the Bank Information Center may not have monitored what was done at the regional level with the African Development Bank, but from the conversations that we have already had, from the report that was shared, the findings from Joseph, and also conversations from Titi and John, what lessons and what opportunities can we learn from the work of Bank Information Center, but also from the engagement with the World Bank and IFC, as we try to also create a platform that will help in monitoring and strengthening accountability of the African Development Bank activities in the continent. So Fiona, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnold. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. I'm sorry, I have some construction going on at my house, so my network is a little bit slow. I will do this off video. Arnold, I'll request you to please switch on yours to ensure that everybody's hearing me, just like John. Thank you so much. And I really love this conversation because I know John and Titi and I are part of the AfDB working group, and I really concur to everything that they have said. So as mentioned, my name is Fiona. I work with the Bank Information Center. I am the Africa Regional Coordinator, and I have been tasked to share how the Bank Information Center has engaged the World Bank to improve accountability, transparency, and participation. For those that might not know, the Bank Information Center is a Washington-based DC independent, nonprofit, non-government organization, and we advocate for transparency, accountability, sustainability, and inclusion in development finance. And we do this by partnering with civil society in developing and transition countries to monitor and influence the policies of the World Bank and other IFIs. So what we do in partnership with international, regional, and local civil society organizations, we conduct research, and using this research, we do advocacy aimed at reforming and improving IFI policies and practices. We do have different campaigns: child rights, environment and climate, disability, stakeholder engagement, sexual orientation and gender identity, which is not so common in Africa. And we work in 5 regions: Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East and North Africa, Europe, and Central Asia. That's a little bit about us. So we really are very close to the IFIs, and we work on the IFIs. Today, I've been tasked to share how BIC engages with the World Bank to improve accountability, transparency, and participation. Trust me, it is a journey that is still going, that began with Bank Information Center 30+ years back, and it's still going. And I'm glad to say that we are using some of the tactics and the lessons learned, the opportunities that we have learned along this journey now on the African Development Bank. So as already mentioned by Joseph and everybody has spoken before, one of the things that we do is actually conducting research. Yes, we didn't do much around the AfDB on the COVID. However, we did support partners in Burkina Faso, in Liberia, to look at World Bank supported COVID response project in response to marginalized groups as well as stakeholder engagement. How are these projects really getting to the people? Are they actually supporting the people that they were meant to or not? So of course, as we already mentioned, it was a crisis, and I mean, they were learning as well through the crisis. And it was good that we did this research and we were able to provide recommendations on how to improve so that these projects actually get to the people that they were supposed to serve. As well mentioned, a lot of money disappeared in Africa, while most of the buildings and flats came up in the night in Africa. And most of us said, oh, COVID money. However, When we did this research in different countries, realized that there are some challenges, all those mentioned by John as he was sharing. But then we're like, one of the things that you guys can do better is involve civil society organizations in these countries. You're talking about projects getting to marginalized groups. You're talking about stakeholder engagement to improve COVID response. However, if you're only going to speak to the presidents and the ministers that never get back to their constituencies now that COVID is running, but are getting all the money out of you, do you think that money gets to the people? You need to involve the people on ground, find ways of communicating to civil society organizations, find ways of double communication, feedback, So we're telling, if you read most of our reports on our website, on stakeholder engagement, come up with new ways of communication, because we're saying we can't move. Yes, you can't move, but we told you, as John has rightly mentioned, projects didn't stop. They were still going on. How come others were able to move and others weren't able to move? So stakeholder engagement needed to be improved upon. What are some of the ways can you use, can you communicate to populations on the ground? How can they give you their feedback? How can they be able to share what's happening on ground? Because many times, as you know, development things, it's more of a top-down approach. But we know that for development to really work, we really now just need to start looking at bottom-up approach. Communities know solutions. They know their solutions on what can work for them and what can't work. So as Bank Information Center, we do a lot of research, and we use this research to advocate. Outside of COVID, I would like to share a case study that we used to eradicate child labor in an irrigation project in Nepal. So the World Bank approved the Rani Jarama Klaira irrigation scheme, and it was aimed to improve services, promote farming practices. They always come with beautiful, beautiful, beautiful things that they're going to do for communities. But when you study these projects with our partners in local countries, you find that this project had cases of child labor. You find that it had limited understanding of the community around what constitutes child labor. There are accounts of girls being harassed by project workers using sexually explicit language. There was a case of a child sexually assaulted by a driver on the project. There were risks of children falling into canals. So this research was done, and what did we do about it? So together with that partner from Nepal, we shared the findings with both the implementing agency and the government of Nepal, as well as the World Bank. And as a result of the advocacy and the recommendations we gave following this, the government of Nepal developed an action plan to address issues that were listed. And the monitoring has actually begun in 2019. And we're very happy to be, the last visit that was in December 2022, our partner on ground actually observed the progress in the commitments made within the action plan, and there were no child labor cases found. So as our role as civil society organizations, it's very important to actually know what are these IFIs investing in. How can we get the information of the projects? Many of us, I have done research in my own country, and when you ask the people, who is constructing the road? Oh, our president is constructing the road. Despite the fact there is a whole signage that AfDB or World Bank is the funder, most of our communities know it is either the president or the mayor of the city, and they have no idea that we have hundreds of years to pay back this money. So we need, as civil society organizations, it's very important for us that we get involved in understanding these projects. Now, where the challenge comes is when grants are given. Grants usually have a period of 6 months to be spent. Between me and you, 6 months is such a short time to spend a lot of money in African development, in African developing countries. So most of the grants, many times people have no idea how the money was spent You go and you ask how a grant was spent, and most of the money was spent in putting up a team that is going to implement a project that this grant is going to form. And you find that 3/4 of that was spent on staff, and little or 10% was actually meant to what it's supposed to be. So it's very, very important that we, as civil society organizations, we get involved in understanding these projects, because if we know and start to monitor, then we can start to ask for accountability. We need to start to do that. I would like to share another case that really got some changes at the World Bank, and we might not know, you might already know about this case, and that was the Fort Portal Kamwenge Road in Uganda. As you might know, the World Bank still funded a very large infrastructure project in Uganda, but on doing research on this project with our local partner, we found that project workers, due to large influx of construction workers, the workers sexually harassed and assaulted teenage girls. There were high rates of teenage pregnancies, HIV, girls dropping out of school, and things like that. And I mean, we saw not so nice comments from our leaders on this project. However, we did our duty as civil society organizations. We're like, hey, World Bank, this project you're funding is causing ABCD. And they refused to investigate and take responsibility. We're like, what do we do next? So with the communities, they filed a complaint to the inspection panel. And if you followed that case, it turned the World Bank upside down, because when the inspection panel did come to do investigation, they actually found that the allegations were true. And of course, the president then was really, told the bank it was all our fault. We didn't do that due diligence, which Arnold and all the others have mentioned, that the banks sometimes are weak on due diligence. We need to come up as civil society organizations to fill that gap. And of course, we saw some changes that are now being taken on by other IFIs in regards to responding to sexual exploitation and harassment in development finance. All that you can actually find on our website. If you need, I can be able to share this, the links. And we have done a number of case studies as well. However, the other thing that we have been doing is using the spring or annual meetings, the civil society platforms as well at these meetings, to talk about the different cases and do advocacy at this level. Because at this level, we have all the EDs coming to attend these meetings. We have the different annual meetings. We have so many guys attending these meetings. So we have used this space as well to advocate for changes and accountability where the World Bank is not doing well. And we have done that. We have done that still. Sharing case studies that we have undertaken as BIC and where the bank needs to do better, and they have come up to actually respond and take accountability where things have not gone right. So we did that at the last 2022 spring meeting and the annual meetings, where we presented a case that we did, and as a result, the World Bank was able to come up with the good practice notes on addressing sexual exploitation and abuse in their projects. The other thing that we have been doing, supporting our countries. So many times, I don't know if I have enough time, but I know you could let me. The other thing that we have been doing.
You still have time. Can we request Omo? I think there's always a disruption from Omo. Please mute, because I think it's on. Yes, please mute your phone or your laptop, because there is an echo that keeps on disrupting the discussion. Thank you. Yeah, Fiona, you still have some time. You have another 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So the other thing that we have been doing around advocacy and accountability of these countries is supporting and engaging our partners during the process when the World Bank is carrying out the systematic country diagnostic and the country partnership framework. So as you might know, the systematic country diagnostic they are reports prepared by the World Bank Group staff in close collaboration with national authorities, other stakeholders, of course, including civil society organizations, if they get to know. And these usually inform the country partnership framework, which country partnership framework usually identifies projects or sectors where the bank will be working for the next 5 years. And these processes, according to the directive of the World Bank Directive on Country Engagement, while these processes are being done, consultation with stakeholders has to happen. But civil society organizations usually do not know that these things are happening. So as Bank Information Center, we usually reach out to partners like, hey, your country partnership framework is going to be reviewed, or something is going to happen around consultations. And we do reach out to our partners. For example, we did that with partners in Egypt and Tunisia. And what happened with these is, in both countries, the main outcome of this advocacy process was to secure more meaningful and inclusive consultations, which we are talking about. Because if civil society is included and engaged in consultations, then we can be able to do our advocacy and hold the banks accountable if things go wrong. In Egypt, a multi-phase consultation process was conducted in several regions of the country. And we're glad that the themes that the civil society raised were included. So what was really pertinent to the communities, this is what civil society raised. They were like, we need issues related to water. We need to talk about an agricultural land. So all this was included during the CPF of Egypt. In Tunisia, the advocacy campaign resulted in addition of 6 more consultations on the CPF. As Titi noted, the AfDB originally had 1 consultation on the ISS for CSOs. So meaning the advocacy is really important here. We did say, hey guys, you just can't have 1. This is not right. You have to have more than 1 so that everybody's heard. So they pushed this to 6. And they went further to have a comprehensive CPF information portal on the bank's website, which was really good that other people were able to provide input. So we do support countries as well on that. And then lastly, I would like to cover on what Titi has talked about, the policy or safeguard reviews. This is very key. Both Titi, John, and I were involved in the ISS review, which was very not so nice. I mean, the World Bank took 5 years to review their processes, and the African Development Bank has taken less than a year. So if it hadn't been advocacy and pushing, civil society would not have had a place at the ISS review. But looking at the World Bank, in 2012, the World Bank started an extensive 5-year review process to update the safeguards that had been put together some decades back. The revised policies were completed in 2016, and the current environmental and social framework, which are the safeguards of the World Bank, became effective in October 1st, 2018. But one of the things that I would like to point out that were able to influence during this is the old policy or the old safeguards did not focus on children nor project impacts on children, okay? So to inform this, what did BIC do? We conducted 15 workshops with children around the globe. I was in charge for Africa. The workshops brought together children. We were able to take them through understanding of what the World Bank is, in a child-friendly manner. What is the World Bank? How would you like the World Bank to respond to the problems in your communities? And you will be amazed by the things that the children were able to come up with. So we used this feedback and input to influence our submission as part of the review. And we were glad that when the ESF came out, children are now frequently included under the category of disadvantaged and vulnerable. And the bank's due diligence for project-related environmental and social risks now have to assess the impact of the project on disadvantaged and vulnerable, meaning they have to look at children as well. So as a result of all this that we have learned, sorry, really less time, I'll put some of the links in the chat so that you can be able to follow what I've been trying to talk about. We are taking the lessons learned, what has worked with the World Bank, and together with Titi and John and the AfDB working group, we are taking these to the AfDB, IDB, and the African Development Bank. As Titi rightly mentioned, the AfDB is so closed. We wonder why it's so closed up, despite it saying that it's an African institution. But I know it is still baby steps, but we don't have to give up. So as I wind up, I will share two links that the BIC has, two links to toolkits that the BIC has published to support and strengthen the capacity of civil societies, organizations, to engage with the World Bank and advocate for accountability, transparency, and participation. So in these toolkits, you'll find information on what the World Bank is, who runs the World Bank, how does the World Bank finance development, why should civil society organizations engage with the World Bank, how can you influence the World Bank, how can you file a case, and access to remedy, and so much more. And I'm glad to note that Titi would have mentioned this, that the AfDB working group, of which BIC is a member, has also put together CSO guide on the AfDB, much more or less with the same information and content as mentioned above. It will be launched very soon and would like you to be part of this. So in brief, really, Bank Information Center uses these and much more to ask for accountability and transparency through research and advocacy, both at the national level. We support a lot of our partners to do advocacy at the national level, that with the home offices, as well as international level. If you want to learn more about what the Bank Information Center does, or what it does, or how we engage with the World Bank, I'll leave my email in the chat and we can talk more. And if you need technical advice on international advocacy, setting up meetings with EDs at the World Bank, we are able to support that as for any CS organization that is looking for more information on a project, or if you want to advise us on a project that is harming you and you want us to support in advocacy, we are more than open to do that. Thank you so much, Arnold, and thank you so much, everybody.
No, thank you very much, Fiona. That was very comprehensive, and I like that the reason that really we invited BIC and yourself, because of already the expertise that you have and the experience, because you've worked around the subject for long. And I like that, and thanks again for sharing all these tools and resources that you've used, because one of the things I've noted in the conversation, this work around IFIs is can sometimes be technical to a lot of civil society actors on the continent working in broader human rights issues, on broader development issues, because this is a side of human rights and development, or more development work that not very many civil society actors work on. So I appreciate that BIC has been part of this conversation, but also the partners, IAP and Coalition for Human Rights and Development, but also the guide that you have developed. It would really be good to have to use that, to share it with our partners, but to also strengthen the platform by bringing in more stakeholders that may not have worked around the conversation or the subject that is in conversation today, but are also open and understand how IFI's work and activities affect broader development and human rights issues that they work on. We have about 30 minutes that will lead us into a discussion or open conversation or questions that participants may have. So at this point, I'll just open up to the people on the group on the webinar to, if you have any questions, if you seek any clarification, if you need any resources or support on what you're working on, but also sharing country perspectives or experiences that you might have noticed or worked on or been part of. This is a time to engage. So the floor is open for anybody with questions or comments that are directed to specific people. Any questions? As members try to figure out any questions they may want to put forward, maybe I can turn to Joseph. Yes, Michael, your hand is up. I will reserve the question for Joseph. Michael, you can ask your question.
Thank you, Arnold, and colleagues. I hope you're able to hear me. Forgive my video. My internet is not good here. Since when it's clouded, the internet is also cloudy. Thank you for the presentations. I've really enjoyed them. And I'm shocked by the findings. And it's really a big deal. When Joseph says that there is little or almost no reliable information regarding the implementation and accountability, it's a very big question, because usually we thought that with our money, I don't know whether really the money from AfDB is really from Africa. That could be a discussion for another day, but we thought that probably, money from us, we should be really holding it and using it in a much better way. But and then also I think Titi says the question she talks about, we don't know where the money went. We don't know where our money is. And me as a citizen and someone who follows up on issues of public accountability, it is really worrying, because then if we are not able to demonstrate that, the grants we receive from AfDB, we can't be able to monitor them and follow up accountability, how then shall we say that we can actually manage the ones from IMF and all these other, international financial institutions? So to me, that one is a shock, and I think it's continuous work in progress. The other one is it's a question where there are some CSOs really that were doing work, we're tracking, monitoring funds disbursed by AfDB. I know Fiona has been speaking much about, work in terms of road construction, but in terms of COVID-19 grants, there are some CSOs that did the monitoring, and that there are some reports that people can share. So I think that I would love to hear that as well. Lastly, for me, is the issue of the grants, and I think Fiona raises it, and most a bit scared. The time limit of 6 months, is that feasible? Whose problem is it? Is it the problem of the bank that is actually giving the money, or it's also the problem of those receiving it? Can't you negotiate for a better term in terms of the time period? So, because that also is an accountability issue. You receive money, but yet you want to be able to do work in 6 months. And so is it a problem at AfDB, or is also a problem with us when we're negotiating some of these grants? Or is because we have no grant, or we have no money, so any money is good enough? Thank you. But this is very good. And I look forward to reading the number of resources being shared. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Also, you raised pertinent issues. I had also noted that issue around grants, knowing and especially most of us that work on the continent in different aspects, many know how long procurement processes take with our African governments. So if you have a grant that you need to spend in 6 months, and you have procurement processes that take years, and so you find that in so many cases you have situations where money is not spent, and then all of a sudden there are conversations around what now, what next, what do we do about this? But also the issue around accountability that remains a huge concern, especially on the issue that Fiona also noted, but also Titi touched on, the closedness of the AfDB, and at a certain point, there was conversation, we thought that was addressed, because the reason why the civil society engagement platform was set up was for the purpose of that, being transparent and also engaging with civil society actors on the continent. But beyond that, I think initial meeting, I don't remember whether it was 2019 or sometime before that, or 2018. I think there could be clarity. Nothing has been heard, and also from John's perspective, how it is difficult to even get them, to move them to do due diligence, because a lot of times officers or officials from the bank in different countries have been seen to be more, boardroom officers than actually monitoring and doing due diligence on projects that they are financing. But also maybe tied into the World Bank politics and the AfDB politics, where so many times they try as much as possible not to be political or engage in politics, but also understanding that we live in countries where any accountability issue can be political, because then all of a sudden you're associated with Are you the opposition? Why are you asking all these questions? Which becomes a huge challenge. Anyway, there are a lot of questions that have been put forward. I will maybe the one that Michael put forward, I can turn to Titi. And I know Titi mentioned some of it earlier, some of the work that has been done, but still, Michael asks, are there some CSO reports that have been done monitoring the AfDB, but also maybe other IFIs, and how those can be accessed? Titi?
Thank you, and thank you, Michael, for your questions. One thing I would like to mention is due diligence issues and lack of accountability or lack of transparency from those institutions and from the AfDB did not start with COVID crisis, right? It's just built on it. John mentioned the Wildlife Project which started way before COVID. What happened with COVID, with people who are familiar with the humanitarian world, it was basically the lack of balance between the need to act urgently, which was relevant. There was a crisis, and in each crisis, there's a need to act act urgently, and there's also a need to maybe dilute a little bit the processes that we usually follow outside of crisis. But then there's a question of where's the balance? How do you make sure that while you're responding to the crisis, you're not creating more problems and you're not violating human rights? Because at the end of the day, development is the respect of people's rights, of human rights. So all these issues that we are mentioning did not start with COVID, and it's actually great that COVID has helped shed light on this. There's something that you mentioned, Michael, about the fact that we don't know if this money is even coming from us African. To be entirely honest, our African countries are not the biggest. Most of, I mean, my own at least, is not among the biggest contributors of the African Development Bank. But remember what Fiona said, it's actually two levels. Either is your country's money that's being put in those projects, which gives you a right to look into what's happening with that money, or there's debt issue also. And at the end of the day, it's not a president project. It's not like the president is using their own pocket money to build road or to do infrastructures in the country. So at the end of the day, it will be debt issue, and it will be us and future generations to pay for all the loans, unsupervised loans that the AfDB and other institutions are giving to our governments. So whether you take it from, is my money, I want to know where it's going, or at the end of the day, I will have to pay back that debt, it brings us back to, it is our problem. So who has been working on this? Who has been following on this? Sorry, we shared a lot of link in the chat. I hope you can find this. I shared a link of the report that we put together. I mean, we, the coalition, and by coalition, I mean, not just us, the secretariat, we are 11 people in the secretariat. So it's not the work of 11 people, it's really the coalition and many of our members and partners who really helped us put together information from their own country and from their own region. Missing Receipts really looks at this issue from a global perspective and put together a global trend. And that's where I was taking it from when I said that this is not just specific to the AfDB, this is where the information is coming from. And so this is the report that we recommend. It's not updated, it was put together last year or the year before, but it's Missing Receipts is the comprehensive tool that I can think of now. The issue of due diligence also, and I would really like to stress that the issue of due diligence was already there. What happened during COVID is banks put together fast disbursement processes. So two things. Let me just stop using all those terms that some of us don't really understand. What happened is there was a crisis. Banks need to put out money very, very fast, very, very quick, because people were dying, right? It's not that we don't understand the contents or we don't understand what was happening. People were dying. There was a need to put out money quickly, and that money was supposed to go to very key sectors and very key people to help them and to help our countries face that crisis. On the other side, our governments, and so the people who were receiving that money, also decided that they would dilute their due diligence process. So on both sides, you had the giving institution and the receiving government who basically decided that, okay, this is too urgent. We are facing a crisis. Let's just turn a blind eye to whatever the process is that we usually follow. And that's exactly where the problem is. That's exactly in the fact that now that we've done that, have you addressed the issue? Have you really helped the people? Has the money really gone to where it was supposed to be? If you look at the data, much of that money went to the private sector. Remember, these institutions have a public interest mandate. They can support private sector, but it's not supposed to be where the majority of funds goes to. It's not supposed to be where they put so much energy. But if you look at data, too much of the money spent during COVID went to the private sector, including indirectly. And indirectly means that it will really be difficult to trace that money, because you wouldn't find a paper that says this money went to this company, right? If you can find it through, this money was given to this government, and then the government give it to a company to put together to manufacture mask or something. But it's really, when it becomes an indirect link, then it makes it even more difficult to trace and keep these institutions accountable. And if you work on that kind of issue, and if you're interested in following the money to borrow from one of our partners program, please do join the African Development Bank Working Group. I think what happens at the World Bank might seem that something that is really not ideal, but is way better than what we are facing with the African Development Bank. It took work from people, it took work from organizations, it took work from stakeholders and CSOs. And so it might take time, but I'm sure that at some point there will be ways for us to also reach our bank, which is the AfDB, accountable to us as the people that they are supposed to serve. That's what the mandate say. They are supposed to serve us, the people of the continent. I know that I hope I answered, but please, I'm still here and happy to add in any other comments.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Titi, for that. John also wanted to make a comment on that, on Michael's question and comments. So, John.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Two quick things. One, I was having a brief chat with Arnold, and I was saying that, you see, there's so much work that is coming through the members of ACA, but also the broader civil society, but it's not synchronized. So you realize that organizations are doing work around seeking accountability for COVID monies, for COVID projects, but then they do not know, or they haven't been able to tap into, like, the work of IAP that provides information on these projects. Because I'm saying I received this information, I process it, I put it out. So they're not able to tap into that. They're not able to tap into the African coalition on the AfDB, where Titi, Mwebe, Fiona, all of us are, to do the actual advocacy. Some of them don't even know that you can hold a financial to account. So all the advocacy they are doing is with their national governments. And you know how national governments can be. They can be adamant. They can choose not to answer to. But also those who know that they can do advocacy at the financing institutions also are faced with financials who are not really ready to get into these discussions, especially when you get to our country offices. People, you should interest yourselves in interactions with country offices. They look like they're an appendage of government. Yeah, the way they respond, they seem like they work for government. And it's always disturbing in those discussions, because then the questions that come up to us are you actually holding governments to account for the money? Do you actually do your due diligence, or your due diligence is fused within your singing of praises for government, so that you can then also sustain your thresholds, your lending thresholds and all that? So Michael, the issues are that there are CSO reports. We are lacking on the front of making sure that we know how to tap into the network the advocacy networks at the banks, but also information networks. We are lacking the information to know how to get at the financials, but we are also working with financials who don't really want to take accountability to work with us to do their due diligence, and they always make us fall back to governments. And when you fall back to government, it has also its own, yeah. But this is an open space now. I really implore ACA, I implore to be able to work within this setting to inform the partners and to let them know that we have this great resource amongst ourselves to do this advocacy so that they can bring up their reports and we work together. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you very much, John and Titi, also for those comments, because and it also ties into the conversation we've had earlier around the technical nature of this conversation, but also the lack of information on how how to move and engage. But it's also good, like John has noted, but also the importance of harmonizing our actions, because there are so many advocacy networks and information networks that John talks about that are already doing this work, that have unpacked the nitty-gritties of AfDB activities, but also ways of engagement that can help support the new entrants into the space, because the conversation around the activities and the nature of operations of international financial institutions is not very open to many people, but also very many civil society actors don't know the entry points. So I think buying into what John has said and also the work that the TT Coalition is doing, but also Bank Information Center, it's now how do we open the space, but also share this knowledge to broader actors on the continent. When I had conversation with John, is like, okay, how do we even utilize the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability? Even if it requires creating a more targeted conversation with them. Sometimes this might be, webinars and Zoom meetings have become a bit of, can be frustrating, or you don't know how they reach. But if there is a physical conversation on this specific topic with key stakeholders in the room to understand what they are doing, to understand how they can be looped into already existing networks, advocacy and information sharing networks, I think then the platforms can be strengthened to develop more strong accountability and transparent, but also advocacy networks around this. I don't know, Fiona, if there's something you want to add. We still have about 10 minutes because we had purpose to end a 1:45 South African time. So Fiona, is there anything to add?
Oh, thank you, Arnold. Just picking up from where John has left, the AfDB, the AfDB working group where Titi and I coordinate this work, we are currently doing capacity building sessions for civil society organizations on the AfDB. We have already had 2 sessions around how to engage the AfDB, both at the national and the international level, looking at how can civil society engage from the project level, from the policy level, to the ED level, and to the very many meetings that are being held by the bank. And result of that, we invited the civil society division team to join us for a meeting. So the idea this year for the working group is build the capacity for our members. Let's find things that are hurting us, invite the members from the AfDB to respond to some of these things. So we have so far had 2 very interesting sessions, and we'll have more going as the year goes by. So we did have another session on the independence recourse mechanism, where members working on the African Development Bank projects who have filed cases with the independence recourse mechanism came in to speak with the director of the independence recourse mechanism at the African Development Bank. He's a very, very good guy, David Simpson, very open to civil society organizations. So should anybody within the team here, should you have an issue or something around a case that you're following up and you need to file a case, or you need somebody to hear you out, we can be able to support with that. We will be having other sessions regarding the integrated safeguard system. Now that the African Development Bank has released their revised safeguards, these are the like food that the civil society uses to hold the African Development Bank accountable. What they are they doing it right? If they're not doing it right, how can we support them to do it right? If they are still not doing it right, can we use the independent recourse mechanism? So they recently released the revised ISS, and these are the safeguards that are supposed to be adhered to when implementing all projects funded by the African Development Bank, including the private sector. It has a whole chapter on OS 9 on financial intermediaries. So if you're looking at the equity group holding and someone who is interested in actually investigating where that money has gone, what are some of the systems, safeguard systems that equity group has to have in place to be able to get this money to where it's supposed to go? What are some of the monitoring tactics that's supposed to be done? What's some of the due diligence that is supposed to be done? All that is within the ISS. So we are going to have a lot of advocacy around the African Development Bank for them, one, to support drafting of the guidance notes. Now, guidance notes and good practice notes are quite different. We want them to borrow a lei from the World Bank. You have put this instrument out. We have done some work on the World Bank on the new ASF. It's not easy to implement the new ASF. So we know the African Development Bank has had issues implementing the outdated ISS with due diligence, limited capacity, zero knowledge of implementers on ground. Now they have moved from 5 operational standards to 10 operational standards. It's going to be difficult. So as our role as civil society organizations, one, we're doing advocacy around financial, a dedicated budget to ensure that the African Development Bank is doing a lot around capacity building of its own staff at regional and country level, but as well as communities on the integrated safeguard system. 2, we would like to see the guidance notes supporting staff who are going to support countries to implement this system. And 3, we want good practice notes for the staff and guidance notes for borrowing countries that they can use while implementing this new system. So if we want to hold the bank accountable, we need to understand their integrated safeguard system. Only then can we be able to be like, hey, you violated your own policy at this point. You violated your own policy with this project. And this policy, the good enough is, it is inbuilt around the information and disclosure policy, which we are talking about here. So if anything comes up and there's no information around it, we hold them accountable in that regard. So I implore everybody who would like to be part of this, let's coordinate our work and let's try to make this organization more open, accountable, and transparent to the African people. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Fiona. I don't know if there is any other question or comment that needs to be made before we wrap up the last 5 minutes. Because I think that was a good point to end on. A lot of conversations and also how to use the existing mechanisms. Like Fiona has mentioned, it's important that in conversations around transparency and accountability, we are throwing back. We are basically throwing back their own systems, but also throwing back their own tools, because that's what we normally have to use for accountability and transparency, especially, and it's the same policy or the same process that we used. Fiona talked about the conversation around the Fort Portal Kamwenje Road and issues that arose that led to suspending that road, that project by the World Bank, but also the work that was done by Joy for Children, by different partners to highlight the key issues that were on that project that required the bank to come down and investigate, that led to the suspension of that. But in a way also that kind of work helped, and much as we're speaking around the project in Uganda, it helped the Uganda National Roads Authority strengthen its safeguards in some of these projects, because it was a highlight and it was an attack on their processes and how they implemented the projects or the support they did on that. So I think looking at the integrated safeguard systems of the AfDB, but also looking at the compliance mechanisms that have been put in place. And Fiona noted, much as the review of the system took 1 year for the FDB, but a lot of us, so many of us did participate in the World Bank review process that was on for about 5 years and set up the safeguards as they are being used now. So I think going forward, there is need to, one, share this information for the new stakeholders that are joining into the platform, but also Titi has shared, for those that want to join the African Development Bank Working Group, please, you can send an email to Fiona or Titi. We can share those emails, whoever needs to be part of that, so that at least there is more knowledge sharing, but also there's information easily accessible on how to engage with the bank, but also engaging with other international financial institutions around issues of transparency and accountability. I don't want to take more of your time. We'll be able to, this has been recorded. The conversation will still be shared on, it's been on Facebook, but also we'll upload it on our YouTube channels for further conversations. But I don't know if, Joseph, do you have any parting shots on call of action? What do we do going forward? In 1 minute?
Yeah, in 1 minute, just to flag, I'm very glad that the center has been able to conduct this study, because from the submissions of Titi and Fiona, it's quite clear that action needs to be taken for African civil society to best engage the African Development Bank and hold it accountable, and see to it that the mechanisms they have are transparent and inclusive of civil society. So not to take so much of our time, I encourage all colleagues on the call to join the working group and follow the money, such that we can no longer ask that question, where is our money? We should be able to know where the money is. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Joseph. And I think on that note, because so many people had noted, people don't understand that the African Development Bank has 2 tiers of members, has the regional members who are the African member states, but also non-regional members. And I think at the count, there are 54 members, regional members, and about 28 non-members, including the USA, Japan, Canada, France, Germany. And the unfortunate bit is that, the shareholding capacity of the FDB, a lot of the biggest shareholders are not necessarily African member states. And the structure of the way the bank operates is that depending on shareholders, it's by virtue of your shareholding, you have certain powers within the bank. But I think those are not the critical issues that we need to concern ourselves with, but the monitoring of activities and tracking and ensuring transparency and accountability of projects funded to the extent that they do serve the purpose for which they have been set up. And as within their founding documents, it talks about the bank was established to promote economic and social development efforts on the continent. So how do we, as stakeholders, work towards that? How do we support the bank in its own way, but also ensuring that once projects are financed, we're on ground to monitor, but also be part of the accountability platforms that have been created, including those within the bank, to ensure that those that are set up to benefit or to be supported or to be transformed in whatever way, socio-economic, do benefit from the projects that are intended to advance those. So unless there is something more parting short, any biting question, we're at 1:45, as we had promised, which really wraps or leads to the end of this webinar. The report is available for those that may need it. There were a few changes that were being made to it, but it's available for sharing. There are 2 reports. There's the abridged version, which is 40 pages, but also there's a bigger report that really tracks the different finances, projects that were funded, or the different grants that were extended to countries and regional blocks for the COVID-19 pandemic, and the different measures that were being undertaken at national and regional level. So we'll be able to share both those reports for those that may want to look into that. Other than that, special thanks to Titi for really guiding us in this conversation and the work that you've done at the coalition, which I think it's a lot that we'll be tapping in. John, and International Accountability Project, also thank you. There's a lot of passion when you hear John speak on these issues, because he's very engaged on ground, but also sometimes frustrated with the different actors that are not doing what they're supposed to do. Fiona, thanks again. Of course, the work that the Bank Information Center has done, especially with the World Bank and IFC, is really something that we look into and see how do we learn from that has been done for a long time, but also the opportunities that we can transform to our work on the continent when it comes to AfDB. Joseph, again, thank you for really looking into the initial big report and helping create this small version and also sharing the findings and recommendations out of the report. With that, thank you again to everybody that has stayed with us from the beginning. The numbers have been moving from 15 to 25 at a certain point, but it's very good that you've been with us for this conversation. It's not a discussion that very many people are part of, because not very many stakeholders, society actors work around transparency and accountability within IFIs. So it's important that we kind of work around strengthening these platforms and sharing knowledge. But for those that have stayed with us, I hope the conversation has been insightful and useful and also knowledgeable in one way, and we'll be able to touch base on further discussions as far as IFIs and accountability are concerned. Thank you, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you and good day. Bye.
Thank you, Arnold. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.